All right. Hi, everyone. My name is Ilan Goldenberg. I am Senior Vice President and Chief Policy Officer here at J Street, where I've been for about a month. And welcome to our webinar today. We'll be talking about President Trump's visit to the Middle East next week. He takes off for the region on Monday and will be there Tuesday and for the next few days thereafter, going to Saudi Arabia, UAE, and Qatar. I think we expect, a very full agenda. Certainly bilateral issues, economic investment and technology will be high on the list, as well as just many of the different serious foreign policy challenges we have going on in the region right now. Of course, the war on Gaza, especially in light of some of the announcements of the past couple of days from the Israeli government that we'll get into, as well as negotiations with Iran, what seems to be an arrangement with the Houthis to calm things down somewhat around the Bab el-Mandeb, still challenges in Syria and Lebanon and elsewhere. So a lot to talk about. And to do so, we have two really fantastic panelists that I'm excited to bring over here to join us. The first is Ambassador Michael Ratney. Michael is our former U.S. ambassador to Saudi Arabia. He also served for a while as chargé in Jerusalem, as really our acting ambassador to Israel, as a special envoy working on the Syria issue in the middle of the war. And he was our U.S. Consul General in Jerusalem during the Obama administration, working which was basically the post where you engage with Palestinians and the Palestinian people and the Palestinian Authority was running that post. And then the other person we have with us is Jen Gavito. Jen is a contributing policy expert at J Street and also an adjunct senior fellow at the Atlantic Council. She also has a long career and decorated career at the State Department. She was the acting principal deputy assistant secretary of state for Near Eastern Affairs. She's really like the #2 doing Middle East issues at the State Department for a while. Before that, was a deputy assistant secretary for Iran and Iraq, had numerous posts as well in cool places like Munich and London, where she also has a real background in European issues. And she also was at the consulate as the political officer, director, basically the #3 person in the consulate. The same time Michael was there, the same time I was working on Israeli-Palestinian issues for John Kerry and Martin Indyk. So I think it's also a fun reunion for the three of us to be here to have this conversation. So I'm really excited to have both of you here. And so with that, let's just start with, and I should also say as we're doing this, if folks have questions, put them into the Q&A section of the webinar. And after doing some conversation amongst the three of us, we'll also fish some of those questions out and continue to have the conversation and answer your questions. I'm going to start with Michael, and really this is also for Jen, for you too, both of you, just broad questions like in terms of just the overall atmospherics going into the trip. What should we expect? Interestingly, there is no Israel stop on the trip, which is also something we've seen in the news in the last couple of days, which is different than what President Trump did in 2017 when he did go to Israel, and some murmurings of the Israelis trying to get on the trip. Or at least add a stop. And so just before we even dive into the details, interested to just get your overall atmospherics and what you think might be accomplished on this trip. So maybe, Michael, I'll go to you
Sure.
you that first.
Thanks, Ilan. Thanks to J Street for inviting us today. So I think from the U.S. perspective, from the White House perspective, what they're after is a couple of things. I think they want a big, successful-looking trip where they'll be received in grand style in countries with which we have very, very good relations. And I think at all three stops, they're very skilled at doing that. I think in terms of substance, it seems like it's shaping up largely as a business-focused trip. And I don't think that's a bad thing at all. There's going to be a large business delegation that'll be with the president. And I think for him, it's an opportunity really to send a message of investment, looking for inward investment from those countries into the United States, and looking for commercial opportunities for U.S. businesses. So I think in all three stops, there's huge opportunities for U.S. businesses. So it's not a bad focus for a visit like this. And I think obviously there's foreign policy issues that they're going to be dealing with, whether it's Yemen, Iran, I think is going to be foremost on the minds of everybody that he meets with in that part of the world. I think the defense relationship writ large, both the kind of quality and substance of our military partnership, but also all three countries are looking for reliable defense sales from the United States. So I think that's going to be a big piece of it as well. And then I'm sure they'll touch on broader issues as well: Russia, Ukraine, Iran, the relationship with China, our kind of competition, global competition with China, and how that plays out in the Gulf. And then finally, you mentioned there is no Israel stop. It is an interesting thing that this would, when he went to Saudi Arabia at the beginning of his first term, of course, there was an Israel stop, and a lot of people expected that. I don't have I don't have a good explanation, except I think what the president wants is a trip that really looks successful. And in Saudi and Qatar and the UAE, he'll get that. In Israel, I think he'd like to go when there's some good things that are happening. And I think the situation there is just getting more complicated and more fraught. And it's not a moment where I think he would kind of land there and appear to be solving anything at this point.
Yeah, Jen, anything you want to hop in on and add to what Michael just talked about?
Sure. And first of all, thank you. It is great to be on screen with both of you again. I tend to agree with everything that Michael just said. Just a couple of points to add to it. First of all, I think I would view this trip very much through a domestic lens. And of course, this comes on the heels of the tariff announcements. The Gulf countries in question have largely been spared the worst of those tariffs, thus laying the stage for, as Michael said, some big commercial diplomacy. In Saudi Arabia, there's talk of a $100 billion defense package on the table. Certainly, the UAE is looking at expanding access to capabilities to AI and other such things. And in all three of them, I think both the United States and our partners are looking to really build on what is a largely transactional relationship. The Gulf has, in these initial months of the administration, played a role front and center when it comes to, if not actually mediating themselves, but providing a platform from which to mediate regional conflicts. And regional, in this case, you can expand out to Russia, Ukraine. And so I think this is really seen, as a doubling down on partnerships that Trump really sees as critical, both commercially and politically, for achieving what some of his domestic goals are for this administration. On the Israel point, just to again foot stomp what Michael said, certainly, we know that normalization, and we can delve into this in greater detail, but normalization is largely stalled out as a result of the Gaza conflict. There will continue to be attempts to figure out a deal, whether bilateral or trilateral, with between Israel, Saudi Arabia, and the United States. But there hasn't been a lot of room for maneuver there. When you add to that the headlines that keep coming out on Gaza, I think that it would be more of a distraction for the president to stop in Israel at this point. And so if you're looking for a circumstance where you can sit behind tables and sign lots of agreements that reassure the American people that economic prosperity is coming both at home and via partnerships, I think that it makes sense that Israel is not part of that conversation.
Yeah, and Jen, and I should say one of the interesting things, at least when you talk to the Gulf states and leadership there, is they are kind of trying to move away from having the relationship focused first and foremost on security, and like really open up the economic space. Is definitely like something I feel in conversations with them, whether that's AI or tech. I'm wondering, and if there's any more detail you wanted to throw in there on just, what you might see as the big announcements in this space. Or maybe we're just going to have to wait and
Sure.
see on that. Yeah.
So practically speaking, Saudi Arabia is really the crown jewel of this visit. Not all, but a substantial amount of the preparation and the negotiations over deliverable packages that might come out of this have really, from the White House, been focused on Saudi Arabia. We've seen discussion again about that $100 billion defense deal. But that isn't to say that those stops in the UAE and Qatar aren't important. As referenced, for well, let me stick with Saudi for a moment, although I would not dare to speculate too much on this with Michael on the line. But there continues to be quite a bit of chatter about whether or not a Sivnuke deal might be in the offing, ready for prime time as part of this visit. That certainly is something that the Saudis have been looking for. I understand the negotiations on that have continued. It's much the same in the UAE. There are a lot of nation deals out there, certainly with a focus on expanding access to, for example, GPUs or chips that will help the UAE achieve its own strategic visions for the next decade or two as they seek to continue to diversify their economy. And then in the case of Qatar, I think there's a degree of rehabilitation, if we're being honest. Certainly, they are an important economic partner, but they are an important military partner as well. There has been a lot of criticism of Qatar in, certainly the U.S. Congress over the last couple of years as a result of a perception that they have harbored Hamas. Again, I think it's something, that is worthy of delving more deeply into and remembering that this came at the request of the U.S. government. But nonetheless, there is some degree of relationship building that needs to continue there. But in all of these cases, there has been a real challenge for the relationships with Saudi Arabia and UAE in particular, as a result of very stringent U.S. export restrictions. And so in both cases, I would expect to see frameworks put in place, or at least announcement of negotiations for such that deal with some of the issues like CFIUS and restrictions on defense articles that will make it easier for those bilateral relationships to expand in the areas of defense and controlled items.
So, Michael, maybe turning to you, and feel free to add anything to what Jen just said in the bilateral piece and the business side, but also at the same time, you're trying to do some of these very big, significant, and important and worthwhile, like economic deals. You obviously have this horrific conflict in Gaza still ongoing. Israeli government just announced over the past couple of days potential major escalation that would only come after the trip, but they could essentially entail, if they were to go through with it, the kind of military occupation, the the seizure of most of the territory in Gaza and displacement of the most of the population. How do you think the whole situation with Gaza and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict plays into the trip? Do you expect, these countries to raise the issue with Trump? Do you expect that to have some effect on how he approaches Netanyahu? Or are they going to try to kind of just ignore that and basically deal with the positive things that are happening on the economic side?
Any trip like this, I think both sides very much want the agenda to be a positive one, but end up it being the Middle East, inevitably get dragged into discussing crises and conflicts. I think that's sort of a consistent theme of these kind of high-level engagements wherever we go, and that's going to be the tension, to be sure. Just to kind of reiterate what Jen said about the substance of the commercial side of it, I think two issues in particular will basically dominate. One is artificial intelligence, and the other is defense sales. And they have a common feature, which is both are dependent upon, in the eyes certainly of our customers, reliable source of GPUs in the case of AI, and defense articles of all sorts in the case of our defense relationship. And I think there's a frustration, to be sure, that the United States hasn't been fast enough or nimble enough or flexible enough in either of those two areas, being a reliable supplier of the most advanced chip technology to fuel the AI ambitions of both Saudi and the UAE, and also defense sales, where those countries all would like us to be their kind of partner of choice,
Yeah.
but feel frustrated by our cumbersome export control process on defense articles. So I think those have the potential both to be kind of some of the big number announcements if we fix that, but also really the source of frustration if we don't manage to do it. And I think it's going to be topic number one for those discussions. And inevitably, those discussions will get dragged into all of the conflicts in the region and the role that we hope that regional governments play in their resolution. I think in the case of Gaza in particular, as horrific as it is, and it seems like it could get even more horrific, I think the governments of the region, particularly the UAE and Saudi, are going to try to do their best to kind of insulate the positive features of the relationship and the visit from that. But I do think they'll remind the president and the US delegation how that conflict weighs on relationships in general in the Arab world. The most kind of the biggest manifestation of that is the degree to which the Gaza war, everything that happened from October 7th onward, really weighed on our efforts to forge a normalization agreement between Saudi and Israel. We were quite close. We were close, certainly, on all of those things that really depended upon an agreement between the US and Saudi. And it stumbled because the Saudis needed an end to the war and a public commitment by the Israeli government to a path to Palestinian statehood in order to move ahead. And as the Gaza war ground on, it just got harder. And the Saudis were quite public about reminding everybody of that there was sort of a minimum entry price, if you will, for embarking on what would be a highly controversial agreement, but one that would be extraordinarily valuable. And it's only gotten more difficult because the Gaza war hasn't come to an end. And I think it's hard to predict exactly how the Saudis will describe this, but I think they will remind the president that as much as he's enthusiastic about getting Saudi-Israel normalization over the finish line, I think the fact of the matter is this Gaza war is going to weigh heavily on it. And until that's resolved, and until an Israeli government is able to articulate support for Palestinian statehood, it's going to be hard to get it over the finish line.
Yeah, and I should say especially this week with some of the stories we're seeing in the humanitarian situation being at possibly the worst that's been since the start of the war, certainly the worst it's been in a long time, given the situation, with no aid going in. I think you can see that playing into kind of really into the public messaging in the region and the views of like what these governments are seeing. Jen, I'd love you to weigh in on this too, obviously, because it's an issue obviously everybody who's on this call cares deeply about. But at the same time, maybe also begin to shift the conversation to the other at least one of the other main issues, which is Iran, where the administration seems interested in the deal. We have some deadlines where it really needs to happen by the end of the summer, or at least some kind of progress by the end of the summer, where you can see snapback and other things at the UN. And you have a lot of concern coming from Israel, or at least the Netanyahu government's very, would much prefer and was trying to, at least according to news reports, convince the administration to go in a military direction recently. So maybe you can give folks a bit of a laydown of how you think these governments are thinking about this right now.
Sure. I think one of the interesting things about the early days of the evolving relationship between the new Trump administration and the Netanyahu government has really been on the issue of Iran, particularly where you see a real divergence between, on one hand, the Trump administration's seeming willingness to give Israel kind of a free hand as far as how it manages its regional relationships, as it were. And on the other hand, the domestic realities of Trump having run on a platform essentially of no conflict, of removing the United States from those. And so I do think one of the interesting stories in those early days was figuring out how the Trump administration was going to thread that needle. And I think we've started to see, that come together a bit. And that is that the willingness to negotiate almost directly with the Iranians really suggests a strong interest by the Trump administration in figuring out a way to a deal. There are difficulties in that, among other things, that what we're seeing right now is really focused on the nuclear negotiations, which doesn't necessarily get at some of the key concerns, not just of Israel, but of the Gulf allies as well. And that is, of course, support for regional proxies, which are diminished, down but not out, as it were, whether that's in Iraq, Hezbollah, the Houthis, which we can talk about separately, et cetera. cetera. And then of course the missile program. That being said, I think that Michael's right that Iran is going to feature very centrally in these discussions when you're faced with a stark choice between negotiating or going to war. And I think that's really what Israel has on the table. It is, I think, for the Gulf countries far preferable to figure out a way to come to some sort of agreement. I think the challenge lies much more, again, going back to the domestic politics of it all, but how do you sell an agreement at home that doesn't address some of these issues? I suspect that the Netanyahu government will be stoking those fires behind the scenes, reminding their partners, certainly in the U.S. Congress, that there are dangers involved with signing off on a deal with Iran that doesn't address some of these very key issues. But if you look back again at an administration that is very transactional in nature and wants to be able to have a very splashy and positive outcome, then I think what you start to see is an agreement come together that's limited in scope, but lessens some of that immediate danger of moving to kinetic action. So I think the Gulf countries, as part of this, will certainly weigh in and try to shape what that agreement looks like. But I think they'll largely be supportive and be pushing the Trump administration to continue with its efforts in a way that, frankly, opens up greater trade channels for them with the Iranians.
Yeah, and I think this is an interesting point I can toss to both of you or maybe Michael. I mean, I think there's some really interesting contrasts from when, 10 years ago, we were negotiating the JCPOA to where we are now. I think one of them being like the shift in where the Gulf, 10 years ago, they were really quietly whispering behind the scenes like there's strong objections to this. And now it feels like they've evolved. The other one is, I will say on the political side, if Trump actually manages to get a deal, then and he can bring, most of the Republican Congress with him, and it's good enough deal that Democrats support it too, you could have just something pretty historic in terms of the level of support that you might actually get for something like this, which would, really potentially change the dynamic. But I don't know, Michael, if I'm painting too optimistic of a picture there, and also interested to get your take. I know you spent a lot of time talking, when you were, in the Gulf, talking to folks about Iran. So interested to get your take also on this evolution of why they're viewing this so differently than, let's say, 10 years ago, when they were so much more skeptical.
It's sort of fascinating right now because you have the situation where Trump and the Saudis, and I think probably everyone in the Gulf, shares this aversion to war with Iran. And I think for all their somehow similar reasons, basically it's bad for business, right? I think that's where Trump comes down. Like picking a fight with the Iranians at this point just ends up a huge conflagration that we get sucked into, and it takes the edge off all of the positive things that we're trying to do in the region, including from his political perspective, certainly kind of getting out of our commitments in the region. That's congruent with where the Saudis are as well. War is bad for business. You start to have rockets and missiles and drones flying in. If you're in the middle of conflict, you don't get investors and tourists and visitors of all sorts. It really makes it very difficult to achieve their internal economic diversification objectives. So for both sides, they just want to avoid war. Now, at that point, though, I think you're right. The Saudis and others were suspicious of our negotiations over the JCPOA, in some sense, less on the substance of it and more on the fact that they felt left out of the discussions and had no visibility into what was being discussed. I think now they certainly prefer that we embark on diplomacy with the Iranians rather than kind of carve out a more belligerent relationship. But I think they're going to be very curious about the substance of those negotiations. Are our negotiators skilled enough in dealing with the Iranians on a highly technical and extremely complex set of issues? Are we going to somehow implicitly concede a right to enrichment for the Iranians? And if so, what does that mean in terms of our proliferation objectives elsewhere? Other countries, if you say even have an implicit right to enrichment, then other countries are going to say then they do too. So I think it's pretty complicated, and I suspect all of the countries of the Gulf are going to be keenly interested in what is the substance of these discussions. I also think they're going to be concerned about us embarking on negotiations that fail and then leave us in a position of only having a military option at that point. because certainly from the Saudi perspective, and I think from the Qatari and the UAE perspective as well, they don't feel like a lot of this stuff is resolvable in the near term. They're not going to change the ideology of the Islamic Republic. They're not going to change their general belligerence. They might establish diplomatic relations with Saudi, but that doesn't mean they've changed their views about Saudi or the Gulf. But from the Saudi perspective, all they want to do is de-escalate. If the Iranians are going to continue to undertake all sorts of nefarious acts, just not in their neighborhood, don't have it screw up what Saudi is trying to accomplish and what the rest of the Gulf is trying to accomplish. So I think the Saudis at the same time, as much as they're in some sense relieved that we're embarked on a diplomatic path with the Iranians, I think they're going to be concerned what happens if that fails. Do they then get sucked into some kind of a military conflict because we've been unable to resolve our differences with the Iranians diplomatically? And they're keenly aware that even while Trump himself seems averse to anything that smacks of war with the Iranians, the Israelis clearly are not on that sheet of music. And there's others, including in Washington and elsewhere, that are saying diplomacy is not going to work. Really, this is the moment of maximum weakness when there should take an opportunity to disable the Iranian nuclear effort and whatever else it takes. But there's a real tension there right now because I think the main actors, other than Israel, are really concerned with just keeping calm at this point.
Gotcha. No, that makes a lot of sense and very much agree with it. Let me like shift now, Michaelis, to another issue you spent. Like if there's a lot in the continued list of thankless and challenging issues in the Middle East, you spent a lot of time working on Syria. Where now we're in a very kind of interesting, kind of dynamic moment. Um, I'd be interested. And actually, actually, one thing before I do that is just to remind folks that after this and one other issue we're going to talk about, we're going to start getting a Q&A. So there is a Q&A box at the bottom. Of this, you can, if you want to ask a question, put it in there and we will go through them and answer them. With that reminder, back to Syria. But yeah, I think we're in a really interesting dynamic moment, obviously, with the fall of the Assad regime now a few months behind. Israel has taken a pretty aggressive approach with concerns about Turkish influence, concerns about the history of the government there, with some of the leadership and sort of the old like sort of extremist ties. What's your sense of what's happening on the ground in Syria and what you think the role the Gulf is trying to play and is approaching this particular problem in the region?
To be fair, by the way, nothing I've ever done has actually felt thankless. I seem to get thanked all the time. It's a very fragile moment in Syria right now. And I have to say, what happened in December is not something I saw coming. And when it happened, when Assad was gone, and with essentially the de facto government became HTS, this group that, even when I was working on the file, part of my role was to remind Syrians and remind the region that we still consider these guys a terrorist organization, born of a terrorist organization and still affiliated with one. And yet here they are in an evolved form running the country at a very fragile moment. And as much as it was not the scenario that I think a lot of people who followed the issue and supported the cause of the opposition, it's not the scenario that they necessarily wanted. But I have to be honest, talking to Syrians that I knew and just watching the reaction of Syrians over the last few months, you can't help but be taken by their just absolute joy at the turn of events there. And you can't help but be taken by their desire that this be used as an opportunity for them to achieve some kind of a better life. Not a perfect, not a perfect scenario in which all the property is reconstructed and all the refugees are able to return. I wish, but just a better life, more predictable, more stable. And I think therein lies the challenge for us, to the degree that the United States even wants to get involved at this point, and that seems fairly minimal, but for others in the region, just to find a way to stabilize the situation and ensure that it doesn't deteriorate again. And I think countries of the Gulf are saying the way to do that is just, at least the Saudis are saying the way to do that is just get rid of the sanctions. It's a complicated web of sanctions, but just let the economy breathe. Nothing good is going to happen as long as the people of Syria are living in this kind of state of deprivation. if things don't go well, if various groups don't behave well, you can always reimpose sanctions. But for the moment, just allow the economy to breathe and use whatever diplomatic leverage we have to try to channel their motivation to be a part of this region and a part of the international community towards creating governing structures that are decent and that Syrians can actually see improvement in. In the midst of all that, like it's devilishly complicated because obviously both Turkey and Israel have thoughts of their own about all of this. And those views, those ambitions seem to be at odds with one
Yeah.
another. And so here's a country, Syria, that has suffered so badly for a lot of reasons. First and foremost, because of Assad himself, but also because of the efforts of all these international partners, some trying to do good, some doing bad, but basically meddling in Syria and just making the situation so much worse. It seems to me it would be kind of a disservice to the Syrians if the efforts of foreign parties to get involved in Syria still was doing that, was still creating an unstable and violent environment in which the economy can't breathe and the people can't see some improvement.
Yeah, and Jen, you actually wrote a piece for J Street, for our policy center specifically on the Israeli approach in Syria. So I'd love for you to chime in here.
Yeah, I agree with all of that. I mean, there is an historic opportunity in Syria right now, and one that very few people saw coming. I think there is plenty of reason to be skeptical that the historic opportunity transforms itself into, a flourishing democracy. That being said, I think it would be a historic mistake not to try to seize upon this moment, and therefore, I am deeply concerned about certainly the persistence with which Turkey and Israel seem determined to contest each other in that space, but also by the United States not seizing upon this very narrow window to lift the sanctions. And building on what Michael said, you also saw from the Gulf states the forgiveness of loans. They're trying to create that breathing room. And I think that as part of the discussions of the president's trip, it would be well advised to have some of those conversations about how we can cooperate with our partners to include Israel and Turkey to expand that space. As Michael said, when certainly this is going to be a bumpy road. These are imperfect leaders, as we see imperfect leaders throughout the region. But giving them the tools to make the best of this situation, I think, is incumbent on everyone. And if you're putting this in an Israel lens, the greatest opportunity for Israel to expand stability beyond its borders is by helping to, being a positive player in this and creating a positive relationship with the new Syrian regime in a way that leads to greater economic opportunity and certainly, builds on al-Shara's recent comments about willingness to normalize with Israel. So again, I don't want to be too Pollyanna. I think it's a very difficult road ahead. But by just kind of, plowing forward with what we've been doing, I think we almost, foreclose any chance of success.
Jen, and can I also ask you, this is last question, and then we'll go to Q&A, which is, President also announced a deal with the Houthis over the past 24 hours, where they wouldn't fire at American shipping or international shipping. However, at the same time, I think the Houthis have said the deal doesn't stop them from necessarily targeting Israel. Curious as to your reaction, where you expect it to go. I gotta say for a second there, as a former member of I mean, all of us worked in the Biden administration. You all are also career officials. You're not, political like I was, but I kind of feel like we would not have gotten any slack for cutting a deal like that. That the Trump administration at least seems to be getting some.
I mean, this says two things to me. First of all, it goes back to the transactional approach. Get something in the immediate term. That's great. Fewer attacks on shipping lanes is a positive thing. But again, let's put it all in the lens of domestic ambitions, which is to allow for the free flow, not free in terms of non-tariff, but that allow for the movement of goods. And it also, I think, says a lot about where we're headed on Iran as far as this willingness to strike what cosmetically looks like something positive to announce in the press, but has very little teeth behind it. So great. If the administration can build on that to come to, build on the efforts that have been ongoing over the past two administrations to broker some sort of real peace agreement with the Houthis, then, that's all very positive. But I am deeply skeptical. I think this was a short-term win as the president gets ready to go out to the region. And I think we're going to continue to see the bad behavior by the Houthis, and certainly let's remember that the Houthis have been a terror organization, either in name or in deed, for years. The attacks on shipping lanes were an outcome of the Gaza war. That's a fairly new component to this, and so underneath all that lies a whole lot more issues that need to be worked out before this is something meaningful.
All right, I'm going to turn now to Q&A, and Michael, you can hop in if you want to on the Houthis as well. But I'm going to we're starting to get questions, and so I'm going to turn the first one to you because I do feel like somehow we ended up probably spending less time on the, Israeli-Palestinian conflict than on some of the other issues. Though, I mean, maybe that's indicative of where, like, at least the Gulf and this trip is going. But I have a question from anonymous attendee in the context of this trip. Any hope of preventing an Israeli invasion and occupation of Gaza? Any hope of at least getting Israel to allow food or other humanitarian aid in for the people of Gaza? And maybe I'll just add to that, there is like the optimistic view. I mean, there's a terrible view of what's been announced. The optimistic perspective is there's all a plan to put pressure on Hamas and Trump will come to the region and maybe we get some kind of ceasefire. But I'm interested to hear if there's at least some optimism of using this trip to move things forward in Gaza.
I mean, if it is part of a plan to put pressure on Hamas to release the remaining hostages, I hope it works, right? But the record of that has not been great. And the very steady increase in the pace of military operations and seemingly military ambitions in Gaza has only increased. So it is cause for real concern. Gaza is already a humanitarian disaster. It's a horrific situation for the Gazans themselves. And the longer this goes on, the harder it is to imagine some kind of a situation that the international community is going to be in a position to help with. Don't forget, this started just after October 7th, when there was this sense that the Gulf would just deal with reconstruction, humanitarian assistance once the military operations were over. And now we find ourselves over a year and a half later in which the military operations aren't over. And it's not making it any more enticing for the international community to get involved, as long as it doesn't appear to be any kind of a political diplomatic solution and end to the conflict. I don't want to cut Hamas any slack in all of this. They've clearly been just an extraordinarily difficult party to deal with, one seemingly totally willing to allow the Gazan people to live in ruin and deprivation in the interest of maintaining power. That's horrific. You also have to ask whether the Israelis are achieving any incremental military victories by continuing this military operation, and whether that isn't just totally mitigated by the humanitarian disaster that's coming in its wake. At the time, even last year, there was this hope and expectation that the prospect of a normalization deal between Saudi Arabia and Israel would be enough to sort of change the political dynamic within Israel, to see the value of ending the war in the interest of this bigger deal, which would be a big deal indeed. By the end of last year, it wasn't enough for a lot of complicated reasons. It still is conceivable that you would have an end to the war, a release of the hostages, and a creation of enough political space for Israel to do what it needs to do in order to convince the Saudis and Washington that they're meeting the criteria in order to move ahead with a deal that would be put forth to the Senate for treaty ratification. It still is conceivable. It seems unlikely to me at this point, just given how far things have deteriorated, even since the end of the last administration.
Yeah, I mean, and I will say, I mean, the one maybe like thing to be hopeful about is that at least Israeli public opinion is very much shifted towards a view that if the hostage deal to end the war at this point will get you 70% approval ratings, right? Or a 70% like favor that particular option over continuing to drag the war. But we have a political dynamic in Israel where, that same decision potentially collapses the current sitting government, which makes it really hard, which kind of is,
Yeah.
the prioritization there has been pretty clear. Um,
Elon, I would say like one advantage we have is, uh, Trump's approval rating in Israel is like in the 80%. Like it
yeah.
would be hard. And I have to imagine one of the reasons he doesn't want to go to Israel on this trip is because he wants to go at a time when there's some good news to be a part of. And there doesn't seem to be that right now. So he does seem to have maximal leverage in terms of shifting the thinking of the Israeli leadership because the public is so clearly with him right now. And it'll be interesting to me to see how he uses that, particularly after he hears, and I don't think it'll figure in their public comments, but I'm sure in their private meetings in the Gulf, this will be a big part of what he hears, which is this war has got to end. You have to use your influence to find a way to end it.
Yeah, and look, anything you can say about him is like a lot of times the last person in his ear, like those things tend to have an effect on him. Um, and there's definitely a world where like everything is nicely scripted out, and here's a lot of this, and then he'll come out and talk about it when he's doing his press conferences because God knows that's just his general approach. And that could make a big difference. I mean, it could make a big difference if he's sitting in a place like Saudi next to MBS and he starts talking about how the war needs to end. That hopefully could have some effect. You know, I'm gonna go to our next question. Which Jen, I'll go back to you. What is Israel hoping to accomplish with their actions in Syria? Distraction away from Gaza, looking good in the public, like this defending the Druze, which has been something that's been on the agenda. Like, what is the Israeli strategy in Syria right now?
If that I understood. I mean, I think in a lot of ways they have an ideological difference, not surprisingly, with the new government, and are seeking to deny that government any room for maneuver, certainly room to expand or potentially destabilize border regions. And so fundamentally, I think that combined with trying to contest Turkey's ambitions there are largely a driver. Going back to what I said before, and I don't have a lot more to add, so I don't want to belabor it. But I do think that it is a misguided policy. I think that if you are, and you see this, of course, in how they manage the West Bank, how they manage Gaza as well. If you're looking for sustainable and long-term security, then your best approach is to develop partnership and a sustainable political situation and not stoke the flames. And so I do think that this is misguided, but it is where we are.
Yeah. Michael, anything you want to add on that?
I just have to imagine that Israel looks at the kind of pedigree of HTS and makes the calculation that chaos is better than that group with its sort of jihadi pedigree coalescing and consolidating control of the country. Now, that's as opposed to supporting us or others working with them to try to move them in a more pragmatic direction. But I think they have real concerns about a group with that background consolidating control, particularly because of the degree of Turkish involvement. And I'm sure they listen to Erdogan's own rhetoric, which is pretty belligerent towards Israel lately, and fear a Turkish supported Syrian government on Israel's border, and just calculate that some degree of chaos is better than that.
Yeah, I mean, there's also, just as we're talking about this, another question, like while we're on Syria, about some reports of like a UAE facilitating a channel between Israel and Turkey. Also, there's been some news with the Azeris facilitating a channel between Israel and Turkey. Do you think any of that could kind of work to at least tamp tamp down this approach, or at least on both sides?
I mean, the Israelis and the Turks have channels already.
Yeah.
And I mean, I certainly think the Israelis would like some kind of communication with the Syrians. Perhaps they have it already. I don't know. This Syrian, essentially de facto government has, to a degree that surprises me, publicly signaled the fact that they have no fight with Israel. And that's pretty remarkable when you realize from the Syrian perspective, Israel is still controlling Syrian territory. And yet they've been very, very explicit publicly. We don't want to fight with Israel. We don't want problems with Israel.
Yeah.
That to me has struck me as an opportunity that the Israelis ought to embrace, but it's become much, much more difficult as kind of the Israeli military presence has become more consolidated and some of their military strikes in the country have become more intense.
Maybe Jen, I'll throw this one to you. On Trump's ceasefire agreement with the Houthis, leaving out Israel, like what does it say about Trump's ignoring Israel and Netanyahu and its negotiations with Iran? Maybe even more broadly, as we're talking about, right? Like he seems to have enough leverage and support with the Israeli public to kind of do whatever he wants, and Netanyahu's not really going after him all that hard. But like, what do you think that might portend for the future?
I don't actually think this has a lot to do with how he views Israel. Certainly, I'm sure it's frustrating for Israel, and it may be frustrating for some of Israel's allies, particularly on the Hill. But again, I keep coming back to the word transactional. He wants to be able to show wins, and so kind of delving into the details of these agreements and bringing partners on board and dealing with some of the more complicated nuances of it, I don't think is kind of where this administration is at. And so whether you're talking about the Houthis or you're talking about Iran, what they want to be able to show is that they are taking away some of the risk of kinetic activity, and they sign a paper that says that that's what they've done. And so again, I don't think there's a lot to read into it as far as how they view esoterically the Israeli government as a partner, and more has to do with two parties in a room and signing off on something that they can then roll out to the press.
Yeah, maybe I'll take the prerogative of the moderator for a second to give you like a little theory on this, which again, I agree completely, Jen. It's not really about Israel. What you have seen in the administration from the beginning is kind of like these two different schools of thought. One, like sort of traditional, I think Republican kind of more hawkish foreign policy, like very much like symbolized by the former National Security Advisor, Mike Waltz. And the other is kind of this more isolationist, um, you know, JD Vance approach to things. Like we get too involved all over the world. We need to tamp things down in a lot of different places. And honestly, if you look at, and it feels like that second view is the one, frankly, that Trump has always been more sympathetic to, but like especially in the first term was kind of boxed out or limited by many of it, like, by his own advisors. But now it seems like in the second term, he's more asserting that. And all these things like deal with Iran, deal with the Houthis, you know, um,
Russia, Ukraine, I think
Russia,
fits into
Ukraine.
this
Yeah,
mold.
for sure, for sure. Yeah, absolutely. Is kind of so it's not about Israel as much as it is about like that approach. But if you're Israel, you're not necessarily loving loving any of this. And Michael, maybe yeah, I mean, interested your take on that. But also since Jen mentioned Russia, Ukraine, the interesting role the Saudis have played in Russia, Ukraine. I'm kind of interested to hear your take on it. And overall, kind of this effort to be these conveners on like some of these key like global issues.
Yeah. So just to kind of emphasize something you just mentioned, like we can't overstate the disinclination of this administration to get involved in any of these things. Like this is not an administration that sees a conflict in the world and wants to send a team out to try to help it. They typically have been sending one person out, Steve Witkoff, who could be a smart man with the best of intentions, but he's now involved in a multitude of mediation efforts. Um, and I think that's part of the reticence. I think it's illustrative of kind of the reticence of the administration just to get heavily involved in a lot of this stuff. It's fine to send one person to see if he can reach some kind of you know, some kind of a mediated solution. But the idea of owning these conflicts is not something this White House really wants to get involved in. And that's tough. I mean, you look at Syria and I hear it over and over again. What would happen if we, the United States, took a leadership role on our diplomacy or humanitarian assistance or efforts there in general? And that may or may not be true, but I think you have to remember that like it doesn't seem like we're inclined to get involved at all. And Russia and Ukraine, it is, you know, it's the Saudis and Trump, I think, in a way, share a certain view of that conflict. which is that it's not going to get any better for anybody. The Saudis, we obviously historically have taken a side. The Saudis never really took a side. They never wanted to take a side. I think their view was just war, again, is bad for business. In this case, it destabilizes global energy markets. It creates all sorts of problems. They would just rather have it end. And I think, like Trump, the Saudis feel like it's not going to get any better for the Ukrainians. Just end it now. It's imperfect. No one's going to be happy, but at least the war will be over. Now, that's obviously really problematic for the Ukrainians and for supporters of Ukraine, but I think that's one of the reasons why they've sort of seen eye to eye. And because the Saudis never really picked a side, I think they've seen themselves as positioned in a way to help with the mediation of it. If not doing the mediation themselves, being a venue for mediation that we would get involved in. Again, I think for them, as soon as the war is over, it's just better for everybody. And if they can help the Trump administration do that, I think they would be satisfied.
Yeah, so I'm gonna throw one more question to Jen and another as we're branching out further. Question about Trump pressuring the UAE on their alleged support for the RSF in the war in Sudan. Has the administration been engaging at all in the Sudan issue, and where you think where maybe the Gulf can play a more constructive role than maybe it has so far?
Thanks, Ilan. I actually think this one, has very direct tiebacks to the president's trip. As far as what the administration's been doing with regard to Sudan, there are pieces within the administration that are deeply concerned by this, and so there, continues to be quiet diplomacy there. But I think the bigger story here is that it's not a bigger story for this administration when it comes to its relationship with the UAE in particular. And really, I think the shift that we're seeing here is away from, what has really been decades of policy, but continued by the Biden administration, where some of these human rights and military adventurism concerns played a significant role in our bilateral relationships with other Arab countries, whether it's Egypt or UAE or others. And we're hearing increasingly that there is not a focus on these things in those discussions. And I think what that's really doing is opening the door, for better or for worse, for these Gulf countries. And Michael, back at the beginning, talked about being the partner of choice for Saudi Arabia. I think both the UAE and Saudi Arabia would like to be the partner of choice for the United States, but we have, again, for better or for worse, made that more difficult over the course of years because we have also insisted on having these tough conversations about human rights. The willingness of this administration to set that aside and deal with things more transactionally, and look at things like defense sales through a lens of what is good for the United States, without drawing in some of the regional dynamics, I think is going to give these governments a bit more confidence that the United States can be relied on to expand these relationships.
Yeah, I think it's true. I mean, here's a moment where we seem not particularly enthusiastic about our existing treaty alliances, and I think it might make people wonder whether we really are in the market for new treaty alliances.
Yeah, no, this is for sure. I'm going to go to Michael, back to you with one more question that just popped in, and then I think this will be our last question, and afterwards we'll wrap. But it's a good one. Puts you a little bit on the spot, but like, question is, did the Saudi government ever actually have a definition of what a credible path was to a two-state solution, which was, or a credible path to a Palestinian state, which was their key demand, at least in the Palestinian track of the normalization talks?
Yeah, it's so, just so folks understand, like the discussion of what we sort of call the Palestinian component of a normalization deal really only started in earnest right before October 7th. So most of the discussions up until then were focused on the US Saudi piece. And that was all what we would do for Saudi or Saudi would do for us. The part about what Israel would do vis-a-vis the Palestinians had only just begun. And so we had only begun the kind of detailed discussions of what that would represent. As the kind of after October 7th and the conflict broke out, and it became much clearer that in addition to whatever else is a part of that Palestinian component, there would have to be an end to the war. And we've heard different language, an irreversible pathway to Palestinian statehood, something that basically cemented the Palestinian statehood as the objective of the Israeli government. Honestly, because the terminology kept changing, I think a lot of people thought maybe the Saudi goal was shifting and that it was never clear to anybody exactly what that meant. There was irreversible pathway to Palestinian statehood. At times, we would hear senior Saudi officials talk about the need for actual establishment of a Palestinian state as a precondition for a normalization deal. The terminology kind of fluctuated, but I don't think that was indicative of shifting policy. I think it was just indicative of the fact that everybody was only just starting to kind of get their mind around what this would mean, and what the Saudi requirement would be. The way I interpret it at the end of the day is that they would need an Israeli government to articulate as a matter of policy that Palestinian statehood is their objective. In other words, they would need to be a two-stater. That would need to be the policy. It doesn't mean that there would need to be a two-state solution tomorrow. It doesn't necessarily even define the process that gets us there, but it says something that the current Israeli government is unable to say, which is it is our objective that we pursue creation of a Palestinian state. And I think that's where they are now. And I think if we got to the point where the Gaza war was over, and by that I think they mean the IDF is out of Gaza, there's no more airstrikes, there's no more military presence in Gaza, and there was a clear commitment by an Israeli government to a two-state solution, then honestly, then there would be a discussion about what else is involved in that. And I think there would be economic and political and territorial measures that would help cement the prospects for Palestinian statehood. But I think if the basic conditions were met, then I think we would be in business in terms of moving ahead with serious discussion of normalization.
Great. Well, I think that is a really good point to end on. Jen and Michael, thank you both. It's great to have this little reunion. We'll continue to work with both of you, and we'll obviously all be watching what happens in the region next week when the president is there. So thanks everyone for joining us, and until next time.
Good. Thanks for the invitation.
Thanks.